Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, here with Sam, and today we're asking the ugly little question behind public shaming. When does a clip or post become a full moral sentence before anyone knows the person, the context, or the consequences?
Yeah, because once something starts spreading, the internet stops acting like it's checking facts and starts acting like it's handing down a verdict. Research on moral panics found that virality signals can increase perceived danger and moral outrage. So the fact that something is blowing up can make people read it as worse than it is.
Right, and that's the starting take. The crowd is often reacting to the spread, not just the thing itself. So let's begin there, the starting take, and see how a partial moment gets turned into a total punishment. Sam, let's start there.
I think the first thing to separate is criticism from sentencing. A lot of viral shaming does not feel like, hey, that was messed up. It feels like the internet grabbed a 10-second clip and declared a full moral verdict before anybody knows who the person is, what happened before the clip, or what the actual consequence should be.
That's the cleanest version of the suspicion, and I buy why people feel it. The moment a clip starts traveling, it can stop being about the behavior and become about the ritual of reacting to it. But I want to keep one thing honest right away. That feeling is not the same thing as proving every pile-on is unjustified.
No, and I'm not trying to launder every bad act into, well, context exists. Some stuff is genuinely ugly. I'm talking about the move where the clip itself becomes the whole case file. The audience acts like they were hired as judge, jury, and public relations consultant, and somehow everybody is furious in the exact same tone.
That's the part worth untangling, though. Before we talk about whether people go too far, we should ask why this feels so satisfying in the first place. Part of it is that public correction feels clean. It lets everybody pretend they're participating in fairness, when really they're also enjoying the speed of the verdict.
Yeah, because the ugly little secret is that outrage is efficient. You do not have to sit with uncertainty. You do not have to ask what happened off camera. And you definitely do not have to be boring and proportionate. You just pick a side, post the sentence, and get to feel like a decent person with very little paperwork.
And to be fair, there is a real instinct under that. If somebody behaves badly in public, people do want the response to be visible. They don't want a private shrug and a quiet reset like nothing happened. The problem is that visible response can turn into visible overreaction fast, especially when the clip is treated like the whole story instead of a slice of it.
So what's the fair version of the argument? Because I don't think the answer is never react or just be nicer online. The fair version has to admit that some behavior deserves public criticism. But once people feel invited into the verdict, the question stops being, was that wrong, and becomes, how hard do we want to hit?
That's exactly where it gets slippery. Criticism is about the behavior. Sentencing is about the person. And the internet loves skipping the middle step where you ask whether the response matches the actual harm. Once that middle step disappears, a dumb moment, a mean moment, and a genuinely serious moment all start getting treated like they belong in the same moral bucket.
Right, and that's why the clip matters so much and so little at the same time. It can be a warning sign without being the final explanation. It can tell you, pay attention, without telling you, close the book. But people hate leaving it there because ambiguity does not feel nearly as righteous as certainty.
Mostly, yeah. Certainty is easier to share, easier to repeat, and easier to turn into a team sport. A clean story gets rewarded because it asks less of the audience. But once the story is cleaned up too much, you can end up with a punishment that has more confidence than evidence. And those are not the same thing, no matter how loud people get.
And that's the part that bugs me. Not just that people are mean, but that they act like incompleteness is the same thing as permission. A partial clip is not nothing, but it is also not a complete person. You can see enough to know something is off and still not know nearly enough to decide what the full consequence should be.
That's the line I think the episode has to keep testing. When does a fair public response become a disproportionate punishment? When does "this deserves criticism" quietly turn into "this person should be marked forever"? The uncomfortable answer is that sometimes the clip really does reveal something serious. But sometimes people just like how simple it feels to skip the context and go straight to the sentence.
That suspicion starts to make emotional sense once you look at why people reach for it. If somebody gets dragged online, a lot of viewers are not sitting there thinking, what would be the cleanest form of justice here? They're thinking, good, somebody finally said this was messed up. And once that feeling kicks in, the rest of the crowd is usually just deciding how hard to lean on the person.
And it is not always pure cruelty. Sometimes it is disgust. Sometimes it is betrayal. And sometimes it is that very normal human reaction of, wait, are we really just going to let that pass? People like the idea that bad behavior should have a cost. The problem is that a cost and a public pile-on are not the same thing, even if they start from the same feeling.
That is the part people do not like saying out loud. They want the bad behavior to have a cost. And once a crowd gets involved, the cost can turn into a whole public ritual where everybody gets to feel useful and righteous and
completely sure before they know enough, which is exactly the problem.
Okay, but the reason it sticks is that people are not always inventing the harm. Sometimes the clip really does show something ugly, and the audience is reacting to a real offense with a kind of ugly speed. That is why the whole thing gets so slippery. The first reaction can be reasonable, and the second reaction can become way more confident than the facts deserve.
That is the useful distinction. The initial disgust can be legitimate, but the leap from "that looks bad" to "this person deserves whatever happens next" is where the whole thing starts sliding. People stop asking what actually happened, what context is missing, and what consequence would be proportionate. They just keep moving because the feeling of certainty is easier than the work of restraint.
And uncertainty makes that slide easier. If you only have a clip, people fill in the missing context with whatever story matches their instincts. Then they defend the story like they were there. That is such a nasty little trick of online life. The less you know, the more room there is for your own assumptions to put on a costume and walk around as if they are evidence.
Plus, piling on gives people a clean social signal. You get to show that you know the rule, you know the boundary, and you are not the idiot standing on the wrong side of the group. And if you are the one holding back, even for a decent reason, that restraint can look suspiciously like softness. So the crowd rewards the sharpest moral posture first, not the most careful one.
That is the part that makes it feel morally rewarding. You are not just mad. You are also getting to feel like the person who sees clearly. And if you slow down, you risk looking like you are minimizing it or defending the target, which is a great way to make caution socially expensive.
Exactly. Restraint has a weird PR problem online. It sounds like, I know this looks bad, but I need to ask one annoying question before we start throwing punches. And that sentence does not win a lot of friends. The crowd hears hesitation and assumes apology, when sometimes it is just somebody trying not to overstate what the clip can actually prove.
So what is the fair version of that impulse? Because I do think there is one. If somebody actually did something nasty in public, people do not want to feel like the only correct response is to whisper about it forever and hope the universe handles it later.
The fair version is call attention to the behavior, maybe refuse to excuse it, and let other people know why it matters. The less fair version is start improvising a sentence before you even know the charge, then act like the scale of your outrage proves you were careful. Public pressure can matter when private channels fail, but that does not make every crowd response wise or proportionate.
So the line is not never call it out. It is whether you are still talking about what happened or whether you have already jumped to what punishment feels satisfying. That jump is where a lot of people stop being accurate and start being enthusiastic.
That is the line. Calling something out says, this matters and people should know. Punishment says, I am now comfortable deciding what happens next. And those are not the same job. The crowd likes to act like they blur together because that makes the whole thing feel cleaner. But they do not blur together at all.
Right. So the suspicion is understandable because people are reacting to harm, status, and frustration. But the fast answer is always cleaner than the real one. The crowd wants a quick villain, even when the facts are still limping in. And that is the first bad answer people reach for. Okay, before we get hypnotized by the moral theater, let's do the two bad answers people reach for right away. One is, they deserved everything that happened, full stop. The other is, any backlash is just internet cruelty, so the crowd is basically evil and the person is automatically a victim.
Those are both wonderfully efficient, which is usually the problem. They let you skip the annoying part where you have to ask, what actually happened? How much context got lost? And whether the response stayed tied to the offense or wandered off into performance.
Right. The first one is basically guilt by outcome. Something goes viral, the punishment gets big, and people act like the size of the pylon is proof the original mistake must have been monstrous, as if a crowd with pitchfork energy is some kind of courtroom.
And the second one is innocence by resentment. It sounds morally cleaner because now the loudest thing in the room is the cruelty of the response, not the ugliness of the act. But that doesn't answer the question either, because sometimes people are reacting to something genuinely bad, and sometimes they're just feeding on the fact that it is there to be reacted to.
So both shortcuts are basically cheating. One says the clip tells the whole story. The other says the crowd's tone tells the whole story. Neither one tells you whether the original thing was minor, whether the context was missing, or whether the punishment got way bigger than the behavior.
And the reason people get away with those shortcuts is that the internet rewards fast certainty. Research on context collapse is a nice, polite way of saying different audiences are reading the same post with different assumptions. So a narrow incident can start looking like a full-blown scandal almost immediately.
Which is such a specific online disaster. Somebody posts one ugly, awkward, or stupid moment, and suddenly people are talking like they have the full psychological profile, the backstory, the motive, the character arc, all of it, from a thumbnail, from a caption. It's amazing how fast strangers become tiny gods.
Yeah, and the fact that it is moving fast matters too. There was that research showing that signals of virality can amplify perceived threat from deviant behavior, which is a fancy way of saying the spreading itself can make people feel the thing is more dangerous than the underlying post necessarily proves.
That's the part people miss when they talk like they're just applying ethics in real time. They're also reading the room, and the room is screaming. So a lot of what feels like judgment is really judgment plus momentum plus the social reward of being on the right side of whatever is already cooking.
Hold on, though. Are we saying the crowd is wrong to feel anything, or just too confident about how much it knows? Because that's an important line. If someone did something genuinely ugly, the reaction isn't invented out of thin air. The problem is when people treat a fragment of evidence like it settles the whole moral case.
That's the sharper version. I'm not saying people have to become saints the second they see a bad clip. I'm saying they keep acting like a partial view is a total view, and then they build a punishment around the vibe instead of the verified behavior.
And once you separate those, the lazy answers start falling apart. They deserved it is often just a shortcut for, I feel strongly and the clip made me feel licensed. It's all just cruelty is a shortcut for, I don't want to deal with the fact that the original thing may have been legitimately bad. Neither one is a real analysis.
Which is why the useful question is still the annoying one. How much do we actually know, and how much punishment are we pretending the clip earned? If the answer is not that much, then the pile-on starts looking less like accountability and more like everybody getting high on certainty.
And if the answer is more than that, then you still have to ask whether the reaction stayed proportionate or whether the crowd used a real mistake as permission to go way past the line. So yeah, the easy stories are both incomplete. Next step is the actual evidence, what the clip showed, what it left out, and what the internet added on top.
Okay, but before we keep blaming people for being awful in public, what actually happens when a normal mistake leaves the room and hits the feed? Because that feels like the part everybody hand waves past.
It stops belonging to the original moment. That's basically context collapse. Different audiences, different assumptions, one post, and everybody starts reading it through their own version of the story.
So the same sentence can start looking like 3 different offenses depending on who sees it. That's already a mess before the internet even adds its favorite hobby, which is certainty.
And social media makes that worse because the post is persistent, visible, spreadable, and searchable. A thing that was meant for a small circle can keep getting reopened by people who were never the audience in the first place.
Joe, is the core problem the size of the audience or the fact that the original setting gets erased? Because those feel similar, but I don't think they're the same thing.
They're related, but not identical. The audience gets bigger, sure, but the bigger change is that the meaning gets flatter. The context that would normally tell you, this is a joke among friends, or this is one bad moment in a long pattern, disappears fast.
Right, and then people act like they're looking at the whole person when they're really looking at a stripped down scrap of them. That's how you get this weird confidence where everybody thinks they've solved the case in 7 seconds.
One paper gives a good example. A British PR worker with a tiny follower count posted a joke that was meant for friends, and once it spread beyond that circle, it became scandalous. Same words, different room, totally different read.
And then suddenly, everybody treats it like a public confession instead of a joke that escaped its lane.
Exactly. That's the useful part of the example. The original audience matters. What came before matters. And what came after matters. Once those are gone, people start reacting to the clip as if it were a clean summary of the person.
So the punishment gets attached to the clip, not the full situation. That's what makes this feel efficient and insane at the same time. It looks like moral clarity, but it's often just speed plus missing context.
And the scale changes the stakes. A local criticism becomes a public event, which means the consequences stop being embarrassment and start becoming reputation damage, job pressure, inbox chaos, all of it. Not because every viral post is false, but because scale changes what the moment can do to someone.
That's the part I keep coming back to. The internet doesn't have to invent a lie. It just has to take one ugly second, remove the setup, and hand it to a million people who are already primed to judge.
And once that happens, the fact that it's viral can make it feel more dangerous and more morally loaded, which is exactly why the next question is why that pattern keeps getting rewarded, even when the overreach is obvious.
Okay, but the next question is why this keeps getting fed. Because if pylons were actually a bad deal for everybody involved, you'd expect people to back off after a while, not rush in every time like the first person through the door gets a prize.
That's the pressure point. The reward is immediate, and the cost is scattered. So the behavior keeps making sense in the moment, even when it looks ugly later. Attention, status, agreement, and a little feeling of being on the right side all show up fast.
So am I overstating it if I say the platforms aren't just hosting this, they're helping train it? I'm not saying every post is fake or every person is cynical. I'm saying the system teaches people what gets rewarded, and then everybody acts surprised when they learn the lesson.
No, that's fair. Platforms don't need to be one conscious villain to shape behavior. If resharing, commenting, and visible approval are what get rewarded, people learn that outrage travels better than restraint, and the environment starts selecting for the loudest reaction in the room.
And once the reward is there, people can convince themselves they're doing something useful. That's the part that bugs me. Dunking on a stranger can feel like participation, but it's often just fast social sorting with a moral sticker on it.
Mostly, yes. It scratches a few itches at once. You get to signal your values, join a crowd, and be early to the judgment, which is a very flattering position for almost no effort. That's why the behavior repeats even when the target is just a clip, a screenshot, or a person nobody actually knows.
Right, because distance makes it easier to talk about the thing like it's a category problem instead of a person problem. You don't have to sit with the actual mess if all you're reacting to is a fragment that already points you toward the answer you wanted.
Exactly. And there's evidence that antagonistic framing spreads unusually well. One large study found outgroup language was a strong predictor of sharing, and each term referring to the political outgroup increased the odds of a post being shared by 67%. That doesn't mean every shared post is hateful, but it does mean conflict is highly portable.
Which is a very tidy way to say, if you can make the target sound like the other team, the post moves. Not because everybody is a mastermind, but because people click on the version that flatters their side and tells them their suspicion was smart.
That's the part people skip. Moral certainty is socially profitable. If you can sound like the person who saw the problem first, you get status, attention, and sometimes a little protection from criticism, because everyone else is busy reacting to the shared target instead of checking your reasoning.
So the incentive isn't only money. It's also being seen as the right kind of person, the brave one, the morally awake one. That's a hell of a reward for saying the most obvious bad thing in the loudest voice possible.
And the visible feedback matters. On a lot of major platforms, positive feedback is more obvious than negative feedback. So people end up optimizing for what gets applause in public, not for what gets quietly corrected later. Researchers have also found that likes and shares can teach people to express more outrage online, which is a pretty direct lesson if you're paying attention to the reward pattern.
That's the whole engine. Reward the loud, reward the fast, reward the first person to sound morally certain, and then act surprised when the same behavior comes back every week with a different face on it. The part that's annoying is how many people can honestly think they're helping while still feeding the cycle.
That's the cleanest version of it. Some people are sincere, some are opportunistic, and a lot are both at once depending on the moment. But the public story is usually cleaner than the private incentive. And that gap is where the pylon keeps surviving.
Okay, so the polite version is accountability, standards, consequences. The next question is what that language is hiding when everybody sounds morally spotless and somebody still gets flattened.
And sometimes it is hiding nothing sinister. Sometimes people really are reacting to a bad act. But the same words can also cover a crowd that wants a quick moral win. And those are not the same thing.
Right, but the uncomfortable version is still there. People like certainty, they like belonging, and they like the feeling that the case is already closed while the person in the clip is still trying to explain themselves.
Some people do, not everybody.
Fair. I'm not saying every critic is faking it, and I'm definitely not saying the internet is one giant evil plan. I'm saying the emotional reward is obvious enough that pretending it is all sober civic duty feels fake.
That's the honest version. The stronger claim is not that everybody is cynical. It's that the same public language can hide mixed motives, and the nice phrasing makes the mixed motives easier to live with.
So when do you think it stops being fair criticism and starts being crowd appetite? Is it just the volume, or is there a line where the response is obviously bigger than the mistake?
Usually it's the fit. You look at whether the response matches the actual harm, whether the person is being treated like a whole human being or a permanent symbol, and whether anybody is still interested in correction once the first wave of outrage is over.
And if the crowd ignores all that, they still get to act like they were only doing principle. That's the part that bugs me. It lets people enjoy the punishment and keep a clean self-image at the same time.
Exactly. And that clean self-image matters because uncertainty is socially expensive. Saying, "we don't know yet," sounds weak in a feed that rewards speed, confidence, and a neat ending.
That's the part that makes it feel fake. Publicly, it's standards. Privately, it's a little rush of being on the correct side before the facts slow everybody down.
And privately doesn't have to mean secretly evil. It can just mean people are happier to punish than they are to sit in uncertainty. A lot of the time, that is enough to tilt the whole conversation.
That's important because I don't want to pretend every person in the crowd is twirling a mustache. Most people are probably half convinced, half performing, and enjoying the social permission that comes with being stern in public.
That's the useful distinction. The polite story may be partly real. The harder truth is that it often rides on top of certainty, belonging, and a little appetite for punishment. And those things can all exist together without anyone saying them out loud.
So the question is not whether every bit of public shaming is fake. It's whether the account people give is missing the part they actually enjoy. Because that missing part is usually doing more work than they want to admit.
And the answer can't be a blanket accusation either. Some criticism is deserved. Some pylons are overkill. And a lot of the time, you only know which is which by slowing down enough to separate the principle from the adrenaline.
Which is annoying because adrenaline is what the internet sells best. Ugh. But yeah, if we skip that step, we either excuse the pylon or dismiss real criticism just because the crowd was messy about it.
That's the pressure point. Keep both possibilities alive until the evidence narrows it. If the next clip is just another excuse to feel superior, we should say so. If it's a real complaint, we should be able to admit that too.
Okay, so let's give the pro-shaming argument its best possible day in court, because the sloppy version is obvious and kind of dumb. The strongest version is Sometimes the normal channels don't do anything, and public exposure is the only thing that forces consequences. If someone is acting badly in a workplace, a store, a school, whatever, the people around them may have been ignored for months. Then one clip hits the internet, and suddenly the behavior can't be quietly buried anymore.
That's the cleanest version, yeah. It's not that people are morally pure when they share it. It's that they think the usual process is slow, opaque, or capture-friendly. So the public blast becomes the lever that actually moves something. And sometimes they're not wrong about the lever part. If a company, school, or boss has every incentive to shrug, attention can be the only thing that makes anyone answer the phone. Not noble, maybe, but not imaginary either.
So is the argument basically the polite process is fake and the crowd is the backup system? Because that sounds cynical, but not crazy.
Pretty much. And the strongest version isn't even that the crowd is wise in some grand sense. It's that public pressure can surface a pattern that was already real, especially when a person's status was protecting them. The embarrassment is ugly, sure, but the underlying claim is often, we tried the quiet route, and nobody with power cared until this got loud.
Okay, now the anti-shaming version, at its best, is just as defensible. The internet sees one bad moment, strips out the context, and hands out a permanent sentence. Not a correction, not a warning, a whole identity. People act like a 10-second clip proves what kind of person someone is, what they meant, and what they deserve next. That's where it stops being accountability and starts becoming a mob with a caption.
That is the part people skip because it feels less satisfying. Public exposure does not automatically sort out intent, pattern, proportion, or whether the clip is representative. Sometimes it catches a real bad actor. Sometimes it catches a confused person, a sloppy one, or somebody in the worst 30 seconds of their week. Once the crowd has decided the story, those distinctions get flattened fast. And once they get flattened, everyone starts talking like the clip is the whole life.
So what's the fair version of that objection? Because I don't want to turn into the guy saying, well, maybe we should all just be nicer, while somebody who's obviously abusing their position gets to keep the job and the smiley office photo.
The fair version is not never expose anything. It's, if your goal is warning other people, forcing an institution to move, or documenting a pattern, say that. If your goal is just to let 1,000 strangers take turns being appalled, that's when it turns into performance. And performance has its own reward structure, which is exactly why it spreads so easily. People get to feel like they acted, while mostly just feeding the machine.
I can buy that. But I still think the pro-shaming side has one real point that gets hand-waved away. Private correction can be a fantasy when the person has no reason to change and every reason to deny it. If the only thing that finally creates consequences is public exposure, then people are going to keep choosing the tool that works, even if it's messy. That's not pretty, but it's how a lot of institutions actually get shoved.
That's fair, and it's why this argument never collapses into shame is bad. Shame can be a crude social enforcement mechanism when softer methods fail. The problem is when people act like that makes every use of it justified. The fact that a tool sometimes works does not tell you how much damage it should be allowed to do on the way to the result. A fire alarm is useful. That doesn't mean you should set one off in every room.
And the context really does change the answer. If somebody snaps at a cashier once after a brutal day, that's obnoxious, maybe even worth a complaint. If there are 5 clips and the same person keeps doing it in different places, now you're talking about a pattern, not a mood. The internet loves pretending those are the same thing because one of them is easier to sell.
Exactly. And that distinction matters because it changes what punishment even means. A one-off mistake might justify correction. A report, maybe a public warning if the stakes are real. A repeated pattern can justify harsher consequences, but even then, the question is scope, not bloodlust. The crowd usually skips straight from "this was bad" to "make the person pay in every possible way." And that leap is where a lot of the ugliness lives.
So the real split is not exposure versus no exposure. It's whether the point is remedy, warning, or just punishment dressed up like principle. And once the crowd starts enjoying itself, it gets a lot harder to tell which one it is.
Mostly, yeah. Both takes are real, and both have a legitimate complaint. One side says, don't hide bad conduct behind polite channels that never move. The other says, don't pretend a viral pile-on is proportional just because the target deserved criticism. So the disagreement isn't whether standards matter, it's how far punishment should go once the internet decides it likes the shape of the story.
Okay, so once everybody agrees somebody messed up, the next question is where it stops being criticism and starts becoming a crowd that just likes having a target. Because those are not the same thing, even if people talk like they are.
Yeah, and that's the first useful split. Criticism is usually trying to describe the mistake and maybe limit the damage. A pile-on is when the performance of outrage becomes the main event, and the original issue starts to matter less than the chance to pile on harder.
So before we even get fancy, what has to be true for criticism to still be fair? Because people hear that word and immediately imagine someone saying, please be nicer, which is not what I mean.
I'd start with evidence. Not courtroom proof, but enough that you can honestly say, this is what happened, instead of, this clip made me feel a way, so I filled in the rest. Then, proportionality matters. If the harm is small and the response is huge, you're already drifting away from accountability and into punishment theater.
That's the piece people skip because it's inconvenient. They want the clean moral rush of reacting, not the awkward job of asking whether the punishment fits the thing. And once the response is bigger than the offense, the crowd can pretend it's principled while doing something very stupid.
Exactly. And the other big boundary is whether the person can respond or repair. If there's no room for clarification, correction, apology, or some kind of fix, then the crowd isn't really seeking accountability. It's just sealing the person into the worst possible reading of the moment.
And if the crowd has already decided the apology will be fake before it exists, then we're not even pretending to leave an exit ramp.
Right, that's the line. Accountability leaves some path back in, even if it's messy and imperfect. A pile-on treats any attempt to explain yourself as more evidence that you deserve the attention, which is a very efficient way to make nobody better and everybody louder.
And that's where the thing curdles. The first way might be people saying, "This looks bad, explain it." But pretty quickly, somebody notices that outrage gets attention. So now we've got a crowd that's half justice and half entertainment. Where would you draw that line, practically?
I wouldn't draw it at tone, because tone is slippery, and everybody uses it as a weapon. I'd ask 3 questions. Do we know enough to say what happened? Is the response proportional? And is there a real path for the person to answer or repair? If all 3 are shaky, then slow down. If one of them is solid, maybe there's still a legitimate criticism, but that does not automatically justify a dog pile.
That feels right, but I want to press on the ugly part. Sometimes people really do deserve fast public pushback. So, how do we separate legitimate urgency from the version where the crowd uses urgency as cover for being mean in public?
That's the harder distinction. Public interest is usually about whether other people need the information to protect themselves, make a decision, or understand a pattern. Public entertainment is when the crowd is mainly here for the emotional kick of watching somebody get dragged, especially if the facts are thin and the consequences keep expanding beyond the actual harm.
So the line isn't never talk about it, and it's not if it's online fair game. It's more like, are we trying to inform people, reduce harm, or correct something real? Or are we just feeding a machine that rewards escalating the same clip until it becomes a personality verdict?
That's the clean version, yeah. And once the crowd starts caring more about the spectacle than the correction, the whole thing gets distorted fast, because the loudest reaction is the one that travels. Then, the punishment can outrun the evidence, the context gets flattened, and everybody pretends the size of the pile means the original point must have been huge.
Okay, but the internet is where this gets stupid in a new way. Offline, a bad moment can spread locally. Online, it turns into a nationwide group project before anyone knows what actually happened.
That's the right place to look. The platform layer doesn't just host the shaming. It changes the speed, the scale, and the kind of certainty people feel from a few clips and screenshots.
And the certainty is the weird part. People see 12 seconds of someone being awkward or careless, and suddenly they're acting like they've audited the person's soul.
Short-form content really does train you to treat fragments like the whole case. You get the most legible moment, the most clickable caption, and the loudest reaction. Not the boring context that would slow everybody down.
So the feed is basically saying, here's a tiny slice, now form a permanent opinion, which is a terrible way to run a crowd.
And it is not just a vibe problem. Research on engagement-based ranking found it amplifies emotionally charged, outgroup hostile content relative to reverse chronological ordering. So the loud version tends to get more lift than the careful one.
So restraint is basically entering a contest where nobody told you the scoring is upside down.
Pretty much. And that matters because once a post starts moving, people don't just see the content, they see the movement. Research on moral panics found that visible virality changes how people read a story, making it feel more dangerous and more deserving of outrage.
That's the nasty lube. The clip goes viral, so it looks worse. It looks worse, so people share it. Then the sharing itself becomes evidence that the crowd is on to something.
And the feedback loop is not subtle. A 2024 study found moral outrage is associated with more likes and reposts, which means condemnation can get reinforced even when the underlying judgment is still half-baked.
So the platform is rewarding the fastest moral reflex, not the most careful one. That explains why every comment section starts sounding like it wants to be first in line to be disappointed.
Exactly. And the audience side matters too. Once people get a few reposts, a few strong captions, and a pile-on full of confidence, the story hardens before the facts do. At that point, even the people who are unsure can feel pressure to act like they are not.
That part is honestly depressing. Everybody thinks they are just reacting to what happened, but the interface is quietly teaching them that speed is the same thing as clarity.
Yeah, and it gets stranger when commentators or creators enter the mix. They are often not inventing the outrage, but they can sharpen it, package it, and keep it circulating, because a strong reaction is easier to monetize, or at least easier to keep attention on.
So even the people who think they are just covering the story are helping turn it into a bigger object, That's not the same as saying they're fake. It's just the incentives making everything more theatrical.
That's the clean version. Nobody has to sit in a room twirling a mustache for this to happen. The system rewards the post that travels. And the post that travels is usually the one that makes everyone feel certain fastest.
Which is why a tiny mistake online can get promoted into a whole morality play. The internet does not just pass judgment. It gives the crowd a stage, a spotlight, and a reason to keep yelling at the same clip.
And that leaves the uncomfortable next question. Once the machine is pushing people toward that reaction, how much of the pile-on is the platform, and how much is still us taking the bait?
If the platforms are the engine, the audience is the fuel that keeps it moving. That's the part people don't like hearing, because it sounds a little too close to maybe I'm in the room too. But if you're watching the clip, sharing the clip, quote posting it, or letting it become your evening entertainment, you're not standing outside the thing. You're helping decide what gets dragged into the spotlight and what gets dropped when the crowd gets bored.
That's the annoying part, and it's also why people get touchy about it. Nobody likes being told their "I was just looking" behavior is still a form of participation. But that distinction matters. Passive viewing is not the same thing as actively amplifying something. And online, people mash those together fast. Watching a clip once because it showed up in front of you is one thing. Helping it spread because it gives you a chance to signal where you stand is something else.
And the defense is always that people are just recognizing obvious bad behavior. That's the moral clarity version. I'm not being cruel, I'm being correct. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes a post really is awful, and criticism is earned. But the second it turns into a race, people stop asking what happened and start asking how loudly they can condemn it. That is where it stops being about the original mistake and starts being about the crowd's appetite for a clean villain.
That's where it gets messy. There is genuine concern, and then there is a second layer where people like the feeling of being on the right side of a fast-moving thing, because it gives them certainty before they have to do any real checking. It doesn't mean every reaction is fake. It means the reward can kick in before anybody asks whether the response fits the situation.
You're adding distribution, yeah. And once you do that, you're not just having an opinion anymore.
Right, you're adding reach, and that changes the stakes even if you tell yourself you're just being informative. A repost, a quote post, a comment that piles on, all of that pushes the thing further and tells other people, this is what we are all supposed to be looking at now. And then the crowd starts grading itself on who noticed first and who sounded most certain.
So where's the line then? If I see something and think, that was messed up, am I supposed to pretend I didn't see it? Or is the real issue the jump from criticism to, let's make sure this person gets buried by strangers who know nothing about them? Because those are pretty different instincts, and people keep talking like they're the same thing.
The line is probably not never react. It's more like, what are you adding? Information, context, criticism, or just more heat? If you're adding context, that can be useful. If you're adding the fifth identical dunk because it gets laughs, that's not moral clarity. That's pile-on behavior. And the annoying part is that the pile-on can look socially useful from the inside because everybody is rewarding each other for sounding sure.
And that's why it gets slippery. People don't feel like they are joining a mob. They feel like they're participating in a shared standard. They think, we can't just let that go, which can be a fair reaction, but it can also be the phrase people use right before they pile on harder than the moment deserves.
Exactly. And the standard itself can be real even when the execution gets ugly. That's the part worth admitting. The problem is when speed, certainty, and public agreement start acting like proof. Then silence looks suspicious. Hesitation looks weak. And the room rewards whoever sounds most decisive, whether or not they're adding anything useful.
Do you think most people know they're doing that, or is it mostly self-deception? Like, I care deeply about accountability, while also enjoying the little hit you get from being early and harsh. I don't think every commenter is sitting there polishing their own villain speech. It feels more like people tell themselves a noble story and then enjoy the social payoff that comes with it.
Mostly self-deception, I think, with some genuine concern mixed in. People don't have to be lying to themselves in a cartoonish way. They can really believe they're helping, while also liking the status that comes from being first, sharpest, and least forgiving. And that matters, because the audience teaches everyone else what gets rewarded. If the loudest, meanest take gets the most attention, then more people will learn to perform that version of righteousness.
So the honest move isn't to become weirdly detached. It's to slow down enough to ask whether you're adding context or just helping the thing travel. That sounds small, but it's actually the whole game. A lot of the damage comes from people acting like every share is just neutral observation, when it's often a choice about where to point the crowd.
Yeah, and once you say it that way, it gets less grand and more practical. You don't have to pretend bad behavior is fine, and you don't have to join every stampede to prove you're awake. If you want to criticize something, fine. Just don't confuse "this looks bad" with helping turn it into a public wrecking. That distinction is boring, but it's the one that keeps ordinary people from pretending they were only ever spectators.
Okay, so if we're not pretending the internet is going to become wise overnight, what actually makes this less broken? Because everyone should calm down is not a fix, it's a decorative wish.
The boring answer is friction. Slow the jump from clip to verdict, make people see more context before the thing can snowball, and stop treating one ugly moment like a complete moral autobiography.
But is slowdown real? Or is that just us asking the crowd to become a better crowd? Because the crowd is often operating like it just found a button it desperately wants to smash.
It's real in the limited way most fixes are real. You're not stopping every pylon, but you can reduce the speed and the certainty. And that matters, because people are much more reckless when the first version of the story is all they see.
So the first norm is basically don't repost the thing just because it made your face do that little shocked gasp emoji in real life.
That, and ask one annoying question before you help spread it. Do I actually know what happened here? Researchers keep pointing out that contextualizing content and setting norms can reduce a lot of online toxicity, which is a fancy way of saying people do less damage when they're forced to notice they might be missing the back half of the story.
That part feels annoyingly sensible. The problem is the internet rewards certainty, not caution. So the person who says, "hold on," sounds slower than the person who says, "burn it down."
Yeah, and that's where design matters. If virality itself makes outrage feel bigger and more urgent, then platforms can at least stop boosting the loudest, most emotionally charged version of the story by default.
You mean the feed doesn't have to behave like a horn section every time someone gets mad? Wild concept.
Exactly. And some of the design questions are pretty plain. Make context easier to see, make reposting a little less frictionless, and don't over-reward the most divisive, hostile stuff just because it keeps people staring at the screen.
And on the user side, maybe don't hit share while you're still in the first 5 seconds of being offended. If you need 2 paragraphs of outrage to feel righteous, that is not exactly a clean fact-finding process.
That's the practical version. Even a tiny pause changes the odds that people see the reply, the missing context, or the part of the clip that was cut off. That's all a lot less glamorous than justice theater, but it's how you avoid making the punishment bigger than the problem.
Okay, but where do you draw the line between proportionate criticism and the whole internet deciding one mistake means exile forever? Because if we're too soft, people shrug off bad behavior.
The line is probably respond to the harm, not to your fantasy of the person. If somebody did something genuinely bad, criticism can be sharp in public. It just shouldn't turn into a totalizing sentence about who they are unless the pattern really supports that.
So the better norm is not never pile on, because that's not happening. But don't confuse speed with certainty and anger with proportion. That's more useful than asking people to become saints.
That's the clean version. You get slower judgment, more context seeking, and a little more resistance to turning every clip into a life sentence, which is not a perfect system, but it's a less stupid one.
Okay, so after all the fixes and guardrails, the last ugly question is why people still want the pile-on. Because if it were only about justice, you'd expect people to slow down when they don't know the person, the context, or the damage. Instead, they seem weirdly eager to skip to sentence first, questions later.
Because it does more than punish. It settles the room. A crowd like that gets to feel organized, morally awake, and briefly, less uncertain, which is a hell of a drug even when the facts are thin.
That's the part that bugs me. The crowd isn't just asking, did this person screw up? It's asking whether everybody watching can prove they're not the kind of person who would screw up like that. So the target becomes a public prop for everybody else's self-image.
And that's where status sneaks in. Not some giant cartoon villain version of status, just the small social kind, where being fast, certain, and properly outraged makes you look like you belong with the right people. It is less about solving the case and more about being seen as someone who knew what side to be on, who got the vibe, who was present for the moral check-in.
And who gets to act like the hall monitor of the internet?
Exactly. And the platform side matters because speed and confidence travel better than hesitation. If you post the careful version, you sound boring. If you post the sharp version, people know what you mean in half a second. And that's what gets rewarded with attention, agreement, and more of the same behavior. Nobody has to be sitting in a room twirling a mustache for that to happen.
So the crowd isn't always thinking, I want to hurt this person. Sometimes it's more like, I want the clean feeling of having judged this correctly with my people. That sounds smaller, which is annoying because it also sounds more believable. Joe, am I overstating that, or is that basically the engine?
I think that's basically the engine. Not the whole story, because some people do care about real accountability. And sometimes a viral pile-on lands on real misconduct. But the mob part is the extra charge. The feeling of belonging, the feeling of certainty, the feeling that your judgment has been validated by volume. That's why it's so sticky.
And once you've got that feeling, the facts start becoming optional. Or worse, they become decoration. You're not asking what's true. You're asking who's with us. That's not justice. That's a loyalty test with better branding.
That's the cleanest version of the discomfort, yeah. People like to think they're punishing wrongdoing, but a lot of the time they're also buying certainty at a discount. Uncertainty is socially expensive. It makes you look slow, soft, or suspicious, while certainty lets you feel useful and righteous at the same time.
So the fair version is not never judge anything. It's don't confuse wanting a standard with wanting a spectacle. If somebody actually caused harm, handle that. But if the main rush is everybody getting to feel clean together, That's not accountability. That's group comfort wearing a moral badge. What would make that impulse legitimate instead of just self-flattering?
Probably the hard thing nobody loves. Slow the judgment down enough that consequence matches what you actually know. Real accountability can tolerate hesitation, evidence, and proportion. Mob validation can't, because it needs the hit right now. And that's the final tell. When certainty matters more than accuracy, the crowd isn't mainly after justice anymore. It's after the feeling of being on the right side together. That wraps up today's question. We're glad you listened to Say the Question. Make sure you're following so you catch the next one tomorrow.